In this section, we're going to go over the actual contents of the document as it appears in the guidelines themselves. So first, we're going to start with the background, which gives you details on the context, where the document comes from, the scope, the parameters, the rationale. We'll move on to the bulk of the document, which answers your questions about if and when armed escorts should be used. And then we'll finish up with the section on the guidelines for the use of armed escorts. So some parameters, some details about what to consider when you do decide that armed escorts are necessary. Now, just a disclaimer up front, this document doesn't contain tactical level information such as what kinds of weapons will deter an attack, the exact distance between vehicles, methods of communication. This kind of information, this kind of guidance, you would want to look for elsewhere. This is really a policy document. Finally, we are going to move on and cover the annexes as well, which contain a number of useful resources. The introduction tells us that the guidelines were drafted by the IASC Task Force on Humanitarian Space and Civil Military Relations, with input from other agencies, UN and non-UN, including DPKO, the Department of Peacekeeping Operations, and the UN Department of Safety and Security, UNDSS. I point this out here because it's important to note that when you do come across a decision maker in the field who happens to be unaware of the guidelines or dismisses them because they are non-binding, you can point out that in fact the guidelines represent best practice according to professionals in their field and was most likely signed off on by their boss's 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 boss. This section also underscores the leading concept of the document itself, which is that humanitarian convoys by default will not use armed escorts. That is, unless they're deemed as a last resort, which means that all other options have been deemed unviable. Finally, the document points out here that it is not prescriptive. That means that it's not going to give you the answer to every single question that you have, but what it will do is give you a framework on how to think about the issues at hand in order to take into account your accountability, the sustainability and the security of your operations, as well as the humanitarian operations as a whole. The rationale behind the guidelines is simple. As humanitarian actors, it's our obligation to follow the humanitarian principles, the first of which is humanity, which means we should save lives and alleviate suffering wherever it's found. But in today's world, that's not always easy. You have impositions of restrictions by state and non-state actors, sometimes open violent conflict in the places that we work, and direct attacks against humanitarian personnel and operations. Furthermore, in these situations, we also have a role to play. It is our decisions and actions that can significantly undermine our own access to the population that we're trying to reach. In particular, the decision to use armed escorts can significantly impact our neutrality, our impartiality, our independence, all of which are essential factors in our ability to keep our own staff safe and to maintain access to the people that we're trying to reach, the people in need. And not only that, but this is really important. It's the decision of a single agency can also have a significant and direct and immediate impact on the entire operating environment, meaning that you could be limiting humanitarian access for the entire humanitarian community. Now, in an ideal world, there would be a systematic and collective decision that's made whether or not to use armed escorts. But given the multitude of different kinds of organizations out there with different mandates, different internal decision-making structures, etc., that wouldn't be possible. So the next best thing is this, the guidelines, which is a framework that ensures a coordinated analysis of the situation and gives you the tools to make the best decision for your own organization, bearing in mind the interests of the broader community as well. So just a few quick notes on the scope of the guidelines. They only apply to the transportation of humanitarian personnel and supplies. They don't apply to the transportation of affected people. They're not for shipping or airlift, and they're also not for static security like armed guards. Also, of course, they're non-binding, which means nobody's going to get in trouble if they're not followed. However, this puts the onus on everyone to hold each other to account. When it comes to terminology, the guidelines also contain a number of definitions of terms that are used throughout the document. You can take a moment to read through them here. So in terms of application, the authors of the document thought it would be most useful in two different areas. Number one is giving a common framework to the humanitarian community for which to think about armed escorts, essentially to help them answer the question either individually or collectively if armed escorts should be used for humanitarian convoys, and if so, how. And you can see with this diagram that what this does is it gives the humanitarian community a framework around which to decide upon a mutual understanding of the situation, a mutual collective commitment to reducing the negative consequences of using armed escorts, but it allows them to maintain their operational independence and also their individual accountability. So the second area where the guidelines are really useful is engaging with non-state and state actors who are trying to impose the use of armed escorts. Essentially, you can take this document in hand and say that we have guidance against using armed escorts, that it's not simply you as an individual or as an organization or even as a humanitarian country team simply being difficult or whiny when you say thank you but no thank you. In fact, you have global guidance that you're supposed to be pursuing a different set of options.